So, hello everyone. I'm Tautvydas. I'm Tautvydas Pipiras from Lithuanian Innovation Center, and welcome to the very first Enhancing Game Incubation webinar hosted by Baltic Sea Games. And I'm Tautvydas from Lithuania Innovation Center. Will be your host for today. And a little bit about us, a little bit about this webinar. So the webinar is hosted and organized together with partners from Baltic Sea Game Incubation, which is a follow-up of the Baltic Game Industry project. We aim to provide a sustainable expert environment and knowledge base on game developer incubation and business support. And we want to enhance business support of game incubators through strategic transnational collaboration with other game incubators in the Baltic Sea region. And we support this kind of idea that if you want to go fast, you should go alone. And if you want to go far, you should go together with other incubators. So based on this idea, we try to unite the knowledge and strengths of various incubators right here in the Baltic Sea region, and to organize these kind of knowledge sharing webinar series for game incubation manager and experts, also for startups to acquire new expertise, new knowledge that could be applied to their new projects or future projects that we hope that will be successful. And we think that as a region, Baltic Sea region, we can compete together with other important game development ecosystems such as USA, Japan, or other countries. But in order to advance in the game sector, we need to unite our knowledge in order to prosper. So today we are launching this webinar with the topic about the market research and the discoverability of your games in the big market. And today our speakers will give you a presentation concerning these topics. First of all, we'll have a fireside chat, and later we will have a presentation. And before starting, I want to launch a survey to discover and see what kind of audience we have gathered today here. So you might see right now the poll open in the poll section on the right side of your screen. So please complete this poll, just indicating what kind of organization are you representing, so we would be able to target our presentations in a better direction to just support your need or demand. So I'll wait for a few minutes to see the results of the poll. And we are seeing that most of you are coming from either startup team or from the other organization, which is not mentioned in our poll. So it will be really interesting to hear what kind of organizations are you representing. So for those who are pressing the other button, maybe a few of you could mention your organization in the chat box that we're having also in the right section. And I see that we already have a question if we are recording this webinar. So yes, this webinar is recorded, and the webinar will be available for you after this this event, and you will receive the link with the recording into your email immediately after this event will be over. So you will be able to rewatch everything, and then we can continue then to the our first speaker, and I'm glad that I can present our very new and very knowledgeable speaker. We will start our session with Kasia Kiran, the founder of Kiran Games Agency, a business consulting agency for indie game developers. She's also an advisor at Wings Interactive, a micro fund that invests in games made by women and people of marginalized genders. She previously worked as the head of business development at Jagex and worked in business development and investor relations roles at NetEase in China. So I'm glad you welcome here Kasia. So right now, hi.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for the introduction, to us.
So Kasia, welcome to the Enhanced Game Incubation webinar, and I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to launch it with you. And could you let us know a bit more about the Kiran Game Agency and Wings, and what are your roles there? What are your relations with market analysis and investment?
Sure. So for Wings Interactive, I do a lot of I've been doing a lot of market analysis for the games that get submitted to Wings Interactive for investment. There is a board of successful female game developers who participate in the first evaluation, and there's a due diligence section from a production standpoint. But working out what kind of deal terms are suitable to offer to indie game developers, that can really strongly depend upon the performance of similar games that have been released in the past, and depends upon the budget of the investment ask that these indie games are asking for. So Wings, I should mention, focuses on premium titles for the PC and console market. So it can be quite different from the free-to-play mobile game market for intensive market research. And then for indie game studios, I'm helping to find, in a lot of cases, I'm helping them to find partnerships, and sometimes it's investments, sometimes it's publishers. I also help them carry out their own market analysis, ensuring that they can see ahead any potential pitfalls for their game, and see if there's any opportunities as well.
Okay, so great stuff. So fast forward to our main topic, which is the market research and the how to make a proper market analysis for game products, games on various genres. So could you elaborate a little bit what is for you the market research, and why you would consider it to be important for every game studio?
I think it's a really important exercise for game developers to do. I think sometimes you run into problems a little bit with people coming from a business background, who have like a very sort of rigid thought of what market analysis is. And games are inherently an entertainment cultural product. They're not pet food. You cannot market size in the same way. You cannot pinpoint the market in quite the same ways, because it's evolves so rapidly. But there's nonetheless a huge amount of insight that you can do from conducting a market analysis. And very fundamentally, it's about understanding the context in which your game is going to be released. And that means you're finding games that are similar to your game. You're playing them, you're looking at like the player reviews, you're trying to work out what the performance of these different games are, and you're trying to sit down and systematically work out why there's such a fluctuation or difference in performance. And there's a billion different factors that go into the success or failure of certain games. But and it can be very, very difficult to like prize apart the exact reasons. But you may very well find that through doing a market analysis that there are some really obvious conclusions or results that you might find. So an example would be if your game concept is a sci-fi arcade shooting game, and you perform a market analysis of that, you will very quickly find that majority of sci-fi arcade shooting games on Steam have very low prices. They have a very low number of reviews. That suggests that the revenues for these kind of games are extremely low. And what that means is that you're going to have a really hard time finding a publisher or investor who's willing to give you money to make your game, because the estimation there is not going to be profitable. And there could be a ton of other insights that you might get from performing a market analysis, essentially playing lots of these different games and working out why they're successful and why they're unsuccessful. You might find things like it's the choice of publisher that could be like the differentiating factor. It could be you might have a hypothesis. It's like the outstanding artwork or the marketing, or it could be there's issues with one game's game mechanics or the way that they're implemented. And just developing these hypotheses and can be super useful for how you develop your own game. So it's not a golden guide. It won't necessarily give you very strong answers, but I think it's a really important exercise for any game developer to do. And it's a lot of fun as well. Well, it should be a lot of fun. If you're a game developer and you're not enjoying and wanting to play games that are similar to the games that you're making, I'm not entirely sure how successful you really will be as a game developer.
Yeah, it's a good remark that you have to previously played all the games of your competitors before you're starting your own, and to examine all the ways to improve those other games. But you said that in order to perform a great analysis, you have to analyze the data. And so where to find that data? What are the main resources to make that proper market research? Could you just share maybe a few sources that others could use?
So that is a massive problem really for indie game developers, is actually finding data. So if you are a major publisher with tons of games that you've released, then it's really useful for you. Then that's like a key advantage for you, because you can use that past performance of games, that data, to inform what kind of games you should be investing in and publishing next. If you're deciding to do a startup, there's very few very reliable, or like there's no really very reliable sources of information on the PC and console side. But I would say to indie game developers, you actually don't need it to be massively accurate. You just need ballpark estimations. So it doesn't really matter whether this game made 3,500,000 in revenues or 3,400,000 revenues. You're actually trying to work out, did this game make $300 in revenues, and did this game make $30 million in revenues? Like it's the range of revenues in the game series is so great that like getting it very, very definite isn't quite necessary. You just want to aim for the ballpark understanding, and you can get a ballpark understanding from like just rough guesses from the number of reviews. There are plenty of different there's plenty of different like sources out there. There's like some quite expensive databases provided by agencies such as Superdata, by Newzoo. They're extremely expensive and out of the range for indie game developers usually. and like whether they're completely accurate is like another question. And they tend to focus very much upon the biggest selling games. And there is also a lot of people use Steam Spy, although that has not been maintained for the last few years. And so the reliability of that is also somewhat suspect. But you can use a variety of different sources to make a guesstimate, and that's really all you kind of need, is like a general estimate of the ballpark range of revenues for a game.
Okay, great stuff. And you said that you need to find a competitor and to analyze them, which would be on your future market. But how to identify to which market do you belong? Whether you are on a 2D shooter market, or and choose everything in accordance to your genre, or you have to filter everything through the target group, and how to select the target group that your competitors are using, and how to evaluate all these aspects by making a market research.
That's such a massive question, and it varies a lot. So give an example on Steam, there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest that players really often quite stick to like a genre or like a set of genres. So they like their strategy games, and they're looking for other strategy games to play. And they won't necessarily branch out into like an action game, for example. And with the PC and console market being quite like developed as a sort of community and as a hobby for many years, people tend to have their tastes somewhat established. With the mobile, the crowd is much different. It's like a massive market. Everyone has a mobile, and most people play mobile games. So the way that you would work out your market would be through like market testing, whether it's like something like using things like Facebook ads, for example.
And you said that there's a lot of markets which are saturated, and there's a plenty of ideas already in the market. So do you really need to create a very new idea for each of those markets, or you just can change something in the current games, or just upgrade them, and it can still reach a good results?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Of course, again, it can vary a lot. So yeah, you have a ton of competition if you're releasing a game onto PC and console. So, and even more competition if you're releasing a game onto mobile. So, give an example, 10,000 games were released on Steam last year. So, in order to stand out, so I believe Simon Carlos is going to give like a really good talk on discovery later on. But when it comes to innovation, I think there's a argument to go in between the two extreme poles of like completely innovating everything and being totally unique, and the other end of the spectrum, where you're copying a game. So the reason why you wouldn't copy a game is that, there's a good reason not to do like a reskin or like do something that's too similar to a game that is already out on the market, because first for legal issues, and secondly, I don't think that players respond very well to a copy of a game. They would rather just play the original. You'd have to like significantly improve it in multiple ways, and if it is a games as a service game, you're really going to have a hard time getting players to move on to a new games as a service game that's too similar. If you go the opposite direction, you go something that's really, really innovative. First of all, I think it's actually almost impossible to be innovative on all fronts for a game. Like, you cannot innovate game mechanics and the game art and the game sound and music, for example, at all different fronts. I think games typically are informed by games that have come before them. But one thing to think about when it comes to innovation is that if it's too strange and too weird, you're trying to sell a premium game, then that's a really big ask for players to take a chance on something new. They like players' time, players' money is valuable. So and there's so much like games out there that they know they will enjoy, that to bring something completely new and different is a big ask, and it is like it's the sort of thing that only gets traction if it gets really good word of mouth, and it gets really good word of mouth for being like a truly excellent new game. What I think typically leads to a higher chance of success is to have a really like significant fresh twist on something that is familiar. So this can be like there is plenty of different ways in which you can have like a fresh twist on something familiar. So like for a given example, Hades as a roguelike implemented a really innovative branching narrative, like integrated extremely well into that gameplay, which really enhanced the replayability of that game. And that the fact that like something like Hades or something like any new game that kind of builds upon what has gone before but brings something fresh and new and different, that tends to be the sweet spot for success for games, I think.
Okay, and you mentioned the innovation part which could be used in various ways. You know, it could be a new type of monetization, a new type of design, and other stuff in the game. And if the developer would want to innovate completely on some kind of genre, what kind of advices the incubation manager, for example, could give for that company in order to assess the risks that comes with an innovative way to build a game in that concrete market or genre?
I would say early testing. There's quite a lot of different ways that you can test. So literally play test. Innovating in terms of game mechanic is really hard. Or in fact, yes, you can quite easily innovate upon game mechanics, but making a fun, innovative game mechanic, that is really difficult. So I often, in such a case, I would be advising the game developer to really focus on ways that they can test and iterate fast upon the specific sort of game mechanic that they are trying to innovate upon. And for any other game, for any kind of games where it does seem new or different and you're just not sure as to whether it'll be successful or whether it will be welcomed, there are other ways to market test your game. So for example, you're not sure if like the theme or the title is correct or is going to be attractive or have like organic discovery. You can pay a little bit of money, like $100 and $200, to put on some fake creative ads, for example, that go to a landing page for a game. And you can see you have like multiple different creative ads which are somewhat tweaked with like different titles or whatever it is that you're testing, and see which ones are going to be the most successful. You can also see if a Kickstarter gets any traction. Often I think a recent example of this, I would say, would be a game called Spirit Swap by the Soft Not Weak team. That is a match 3 game. And it's innovative in that it's integrating narrative, it's based in a Middle Eastern background, with gender diverse characters and so forth. But match 3 the games on PC and console typically do not sell well. However, they launched a successful Kickstarter, which now is a clear signal to publishers and investors that actually this is a game that could be successful, and this innovation is actually not so risky. So they've managed to de-risk themselves as an investment by launching a successful Kickstarter, and I'm sure the extra money also comes in handy.
And for example, if you're creating something more innovative and you're planning to spend more money than your competitors did, could you estimate is it even possible to forecast the willingness to pay of the concrete target group for if you are releasing more innovative game with some kind of innovative features or new features, but it is dedicated for the same target group that your competitor did?
Wow. There is an aspect where players are kind of trained to expect certain prices for particular genres, and like that is something to bear in mind. If you also have to bear in mind like the disposable income, for example, of the players. This is a very hard question to answer without having more like specific examples, because a lot of it there are so many different factors into this. It's not an easy answer, I'm afraid.
Okay, and just a small reminder for all who is participating in this webinar, you can post your questions in the question box right in the right of your screen. I see that few of them are already there, so we will try to answer them at the end of this fireside chat with Kasia. And to continue on the validation of the idea, and when the creators and developers want to see if their idea would be valid in the future, because everything that we're making with the market research is based on the past data. Mm-hmm. And for example, RPG is the type of game that we want to play right now. It's quite popular, but to develop a game, it takes some time. So how to evaluate whether the same genre, the same game, or quite the same game would be popular in maybe a few months or maybe a few years?
Yeah, this one I'd be looking at the trends, right? So I would be comparing the success of, in this case, RPGs in the last couple of years, whether like RPGs have increased markedly in popularity in the last couple of years, or whether it's been kind of flat. If it's been kind of flat, that kind of suggests that maybe it's unlikely to increase in popularity by the time you've released your game. And there's a chance that it is saturated. Like a good sign is when there's recently been a few games in this genre, or it's like an emerging genre, and you're making a game within that emerging genre. But that's quite hard to pinpoint, although I think it is possible. Yeah.
And as you already forwarded to the topic of the trends and the future genres that could be very popular in the future, how to anticipate those trends, and what other markets could be analyzed in order to forecast what would be a hot topic in the nearest future?
So in terms of what there's multiple ways to look at trends. So you can look at trends, for example, from the platform, the device, in fact, like whether there's any new devices coming out that has or potential for new technology that then gives potential for new gameplay. If there's like an uptake in a strong uptake in a certain type of new device, then that's often very, very risky, but could have very high reward. Then, so that's one framework. You can also look at platforms like the digital platforms, whether there's new platforms such as the kind of streaming platform that might take off. There's again, there's also slightly separated from device technology. There's like literal software technology that can again create new forms of gameplay, which could be exciting for players. That's something that is often worth keeping an eye on. It's generally advances, and then also I think if there's a trends in terms of players. So whether that's like regional, whether there's a particular area of the world which is increasing in disposable income, and has a more leisure time, and therefore are more likely to be interested in games or have more to spend upon games. That's often a trend to be tracked. Whether there's a segment of the population that is playing games more and more. A lot of times these trends are completely unpredictable. So, for example, the biggest impact upon game sales in last year has been, of course, a global pandemic increasing massive desire for home entertainment. I guess the trend that you can foresee is that probably in the next 6 months there'll be or as vaccination programs improve or roll out amongst the world, you'll see on like country basis a marked decrease in demand for home entertainment. So therefore, I think game sales are likely to be impacted. But having said, I think the long term, the pandemic and the increase in players has been a very good trend for the games industry. And yeah, there's multiple ways to look at these trends, and there's multiple news sites. There's multiple social media sites, social hashtags you can take note of and investigate and see what kind of burgeoning interest is happening in different areas.
So looking forward to the future, have you any idea what kind of games will be popular when the pandemic will be over? When we are seeing socializing game is very popular right now, what kind of games will change that?
That's a good question. I think that it's going to be quite hard for games that you play at home to compete with outside entertainment when so many people have been yearning for socializing in real life with other people for so long. But that means that probably like games which are more in person, like board games, might see a bit of an increase. Then, but I do think that will eventually normalize, and I don't think that it's not really something that you can run to invest in right now, or like make a game for right now. This is the thing with the games market. You can it's worth trying to predict. It's worth trying. It's worth researching the past, but it is inherently super unpredictable market. So you have to bear that in mind, that its failure is very high for a lot of games development studios. And the median game on Steam makes $4,000 in total lifetime revenues. Like that's ridiculously low. So as such a hit-driven business, it's always a massive risk. And if you're making games to get rich, you are making the wrong life choice, I think.
So for example, if the game had success in some kind of market in geographically in US or Europe, and they want to repeat the same success in other geographical markets like Chinese market or Japanese market, what kind of sensitive or cultural aspects do they have to be aware of when trying to make that culturalization of their own game?
That is like a super difficult well, China's a really hard market at the moment, due to the fact that the Chinese government has a very strong process for allowing games in. Games are somewhat accessible via Steam, but the government has recently cracked down upon the sort of grey market that Apple represented, the iOS store represented, and Chinese government is also very large, and lots of different departments kind of hold sway, and they also have, it's very difficult to predict what the Chinese government is going to choose to do. So I always counsel for Western game developers looking towards China is essentially be opportunistic, and try and get as much money up front as possible. It is what generally worth in translating your game, localizing your game into simplified Chinese, as it's such a large market, and there are a lot of gamers with Steam who can access games. But this is again something that might be cut off because of Steam China, which is like a new platform run by Perfect World. And so perhaps it's going to be the case where you're going to need, the Chinese players will need VPNs to access Steam International platform from at a certain point. Who knows? So yeah, it's not something that I would say is a very something that's easy to plan, is like getting into the Chinese market. It's more of like, if you can, and it's worth a try. If you can, great, but I wouldn't hinge your business plan upon it. And I'd also will note that any games that sort of mention sensitive topics such as Tibet, etc., will obviously have a hard time. Any games that have any kind of sexual content, too much gore, even things like references to spirits, will have a hard time getting through the process of censorship by the Chinese government.
Okay, so very important insights to take into account if you are considering these markets. And maybe you have other markets in your mind when you're thinking of oversaturated or hard to enter markets.
Yeah, I mean, it's from my experience working in East Asia and bringing Western games into Asian markets, it was actually quite interesting in that, like initially the thought was that you'd have to culturalize the game a lot and do a lot of changes to the game to make it appealing to the local population, but that actually we found that wasn't the case in the end, and that the local population often quite um, found it exotic that this was a game that was from the West, and that they found like culturalization changes felt a bit bolted on a little. And I think you could probably understand that from playing us, as a Westerner. If you play games from Japan, there's often like quite a lot of charm about it being like very strongly rooted in Japan, and Japanese culture. So thinking about it from like a culturalization perspective, it's not always the case where you have to be very careful to culturalize it to each market. That having said, each market will have its own expectations, will have its own history in terms of like games that were popular and successful there, and the games that people have played in the past impacts their expectations for the games that they play, or decide to play. So give an example of this, lots of Chinese players are really used to playing MRPGs on mobile. They have extremely like extremely solid, like rigid expectations and understanding of how MMORPG gameplay on mobile should be like. So bringing a Western MMORPG into that on mobile to China is actually really hard, because typically the MMORPGs from that region are much more sophisticated than any MMORPG on mobile in the West. So you have to kind of understand a lot of detail about the local market and the local market's history, and it's really hard for Western developers to do that, which is why I'm always like, just be opportunistic and talk to local publishers and see what opportunities there are. But you'd often have to sort of weigh up whether it's really like a valuable use of your time or not.
Okay, so let's continue a bit on the trends, the future trends or the past trends. So we have partners in our consortia that are making VR games. Also, we have a few of them in our community here in Lithuania. So all of them are very aware if the VR hype is over, or we should stick to it and build products for this market.
So VR is tricky. I don't think that VR is ever going to be VR games are never going to be as successful as mobile games, for example. Like there's no way. But there is a opportunity, there is a possibility that AR glasses could be the next transformative product, like in the same way that mobile phones were a transformative product. But AR glasses are like a decade away at least. So if you are making VR games right now and say that there's in like 15 years time, there's AR glasses like becoming popularized, then of course you'd be in a very good position to be making games for those AR glasses. But it's very high risk. Hopefully it'll be high reward, but it's extremely risky at this moment to be making VR games, I would say. And it's generally in the case for VR games at the moment. There's only like a small handful of games take the vast majority of revenues on VR platforms. And they all tend to be of like a certain type of game, that, like for example, Beat Saber or Super Hot or Pistol Whip, where it's very action orientated. It's extremely suited to VR. It's something that is enjoyable, like feels enjoyable to do, like full body wise feels enjoyable to do. So I would probably be looking. I'm not entirely sure if I was in the position of a VR developer, whether you'd have to be very passionate about making games for VR to continue to do it. But some people are.
Okay, so thank you for your honest opinion about that. And that we see that the age of the gamers are increasing currently. So many millennials are coming back into the game industry. They're teaching their own children how to play some games. So maybe developers could right now target this kind of group of people and try to revive the old trends that were very popular in the market maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and which just reminds that those millennials about their youth and arcade games.
Yeah, I mean, there's nostalgia is extremely strong driver for purchasing. I'm instantly thinking of games like Octopath Traveler, which is a sort of JRPG that's based upon like really classic JRPGs. And if you never really were into classic JRPGs, you find it completely impenetrable to play. But it was really quite a success amongst people who loved playing JRPGs back in the day. And it certainly could be the case where you have like a resurgence in nostalgia. Like there's been quite, for example, Nintendo's had quite a nice bit of success with a reissue, and Sony as well with reissue of the old consoles. So it's definitely something that you could target for sure.
Okay, just again, a small reminder to our audience. These are the last few moments for you to write down the questions for Kasia, because after a few questions, we are going to your questions. So pop out those questions in the question box, and just going to our final questions. So what niche or platforms seems the most promising for you in 2022, maybe? Could you make some predictions and direct our listeners to some kind of direction?
That's a really hard question. It's super hard. I would say, and this you might find like I'm one of the very few people who will say this, but I'm actually really interested and excited by some developments in the narrative game design. That's current, or narrative game design technology, I should say. So typically, narrative games are done really poorly, and I think that's firstly because it's quite time consuming to develop, and there's very little replayability. So the game comes out, it's very quickly consumed, and it sort of disappears from view. Whereas more system driven games have much more better replayability typically. So they stay front of mind for much longer. And they can be developed into games as a service kind of games. But we're seeing now there's some game studios that are doing some really exciting things with narrative design. I think that the success of Hades last year is a signifier of this, with the narrative design behind it being a really key driver for its success. And yeah, I do see like opportunity and potential there.
Okay, great stuff. And I think that we can move on to the questions from our audience, because we have a few of those, and we hope that we will manage to answer all of them. And most votes right now have received Friedrich's question. It's about, when comparing your game to competitors, what metrics do you choose to focus on when choosing which competitor to use?
Well, let's see. That's really like a game by game basis. I often like you should be looking at lots of different games. Sometimes it's really obvious, like which games are your competitor games, but sometimes it's really not obvious at all. When you've got really clear competitive games, it can be super obvious as to what kind of metrics or what kind of elements you should be looking at when sort of studying these games. Sometimes it's the games are clearly one game is clearly successful because it has like a outstandingly beautiful art style that just grabbed everyone's attention, or it might be the case when it could be like the marketing campaign was for one was much better than the other one. It's the most useful is when you have like two really similar games come out roughly the same time. One of them does really well, and one of them really doesn't, and you're like, okay, why is that? You can go through absolutely every factor to see what could be the difference. Both like in the gameplay and also the way that it was marketed and shown. As to the choosing of competitors, usually then it's often a bit of a spectrum. So there's like certain competitors which are kind of quite similar, and then and then they sort of trail off in terms of similarity. And like generally, I would say often like the more recent competitors are the more useful ones to look at, uh, because the game market just changes so fast. I also it can be quite interesting to look at similar games that are quite different, that are similar to your game concept, but are kind of differentiated quite significantly from each other. So you can also that what I mean is that, you know, if like one of them belongs in a certain genre and one of them belongs in another genre, and your game is somewhat in the middle, you can maybe look at and understand the habits of the gamers for the different genres. So, for example, maybe one game genre one genre game players are much more willing to spend money on on games than the other game genres. That means that maybe you should market and pivot your game concept towards the more like high paying genre. Maybe one game genre is like really super saturated and had a lot of games come out last year and not seen a lot of them failed, like even really good ones that you would expect otherwise to do well. So yeah, again, tons of different factors, and it's a case by case basis, but like a lot of it can be often like common sense, and just spending the time to think about it is really useful.
Thanks for your answer. And very concrete question from Janos Yago. Should you nowadays make a 2D or 3D game? Is there a big difference in their sales?
I don't know, but you can really easily find out. I mean, I quite like using there's a couple of sites like vginsights.com or Game Data Crunch, and they look at games on Steam, and there are tags for 2D, tags for 3D, and you can take a look at the games tag 2D and the games tag 3D, and see and then literally make a comparison and see which ones are more successful, and particularly looking, but you have to like divide it into like your genre, etc. So and you may want to consider just generally, like from a qualitative perspective, 2D games tend to be considered to be more simplified. And then you may also want to, by the audience, and then you maybe also want to consider from a production point of view, like 3D might be more expensive for you, or maybe 2D is more expensive for you. And yeah, there'll be a lot of factors for this decision.
Okay, moving on to the other questions, and we are heading to the question provided by Ola. And his question is, there are statistics that show that the number of released games is anti-correlated to the median earnings. How would you explain this counterintuitive statistics? That is there something we can learn from it? And she's providing a link to howtomarketgame.com.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's so. I think I don't have I don't think I've actually read that particular blog post, although I tend to try and read everything by Chris Zukowski because he's fantastic. So I'm not sure if I fully understand, or I would need to like dig a bit more deeper into like the data behind this particular question. But I usually like if you have too many games, if there is a thing where game genres can become saturated, so maybe there's only a certain number of players who want to play that kind of genre, and they've only got a certain amount of time, a certain amount of money, and then if too many games that come out at the same time, that then they only can have time and money to pick one, and the best one. So therefore, it can happen that a game genre can be saturated. But generally speaking, in the last few years, whilst the number of games have increased, also the number of players has significantly increased, and increased at a faster rate than the number of games. So it is or a similar rate, shall we say? So therefore, it's still like an attractive industry and market to be in currently. But how long that situation might last is another question.
Okay, we have still some time for a few questions, and the question from Ott, and his questioning is that there's multiple games in a mobile market, also in the desktop platforms, which are pretty successful ones, and the companies are building the same concept, just trying to replicate the success. So the question is, what would you recommend to copy games like this in order to build a brand, or you would just recommend to innovate and do something better and innovative on those genres?
I mean, well, it depends on the amount of innovation that you do. So doing like a new twist on a genre, but keeping a lot of like things familiar is often quite a good way of like keeping things fresh without driving away your existing players. But it depends upon the players. It also depends upon the game genre as well. Like if it's like a kind of game that is like very quickly consumed, like sometimes the players just want a lot more of the same. And if it's like a kind of game which has more lengthy sort of replayability and so on, then having like those kind of fresh twists is kind of good. I would say that like completely switching genres is difficult, and like really I should reframe that. It's like your life cuts a lot easier if your studio is known for being really good at making a certain kind of game by players, and you get to learn how to make those kind of games successful. You get to learn how to market to those players more successfully. So um, yeah, it will again case by case basis, but having a brand is always useful.
Okay, new question from Pedro. In your perspective, for a young game development startup, is it better to bet on a genre with a wide and established audience, or to look for a specific niche and build a community around it?
I go for the latter. I think that if you have like a genre with a wide and established audience, you'll also have established game developers making serving that audience, and they will know how to make games for those audiences better than you can. Um, I think that if you're a young game development startup looking for those kind of emerging trends, looking for those kind of emerging areas, or looking for that underserved niche, and building that up and building community there, I think that's going to be like a much easier. And I think that once you have like a niche in the community, you can always work to expand and build out that niche and build out that community. It's a lot harder to fight for market share with more established competitors unless you somehow have like a advantage. But it's very hard to get like a definitive advantage when you're a young startup.
And I see that Alexei's question is waiting for an answer for quite some time. So would you say a game that takes place in a Buddhist realm will be hard to bring to Asia?
I think it would be very hard to get through the Chinese government process. I think that no Chinese publisher will even want to try to get it through the process. Like they would have kind of limited number of slots of foreign games that they can enter into this process, or that get approved. So yeah, I think it'd be really hard to get that into China specifically. For Japan and Korea, I am less certain. I think that both of those countries have a much more um, like a long relationship with Buddhism. I think you have to make sure that it's uh, accurate and respectful, or you have to be extremely culturally sensitive. And Buddhism is a sort of very has multiple sects and multiple interpretations. So it's quite a difficult one to make into a piece entertainment.
Okay, so we are heading, I think, to our final question, and it's a very concrete one. What platform do you recommend to build games? Unity, Unreal Engine, CryEngine, Coco 2D, Godot, or something else?
I would tend to go for Unity or Unreal Engine. And currently Unreal has a really good mega grant program for for studios. So they can sometimes they will grant a bit of money, which can be super helpful for like small things. And then, but this is really a question for your development team. I mean, from a market perspective, players do not notice or care.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for all those answers. And the last question for you: Can you let people know where to find you, or where to find Wings, how to contact you?
Sure. So I can be contacted. You can follow me on Twitter at Cassia Curran. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can also email me at cassia@curran.games. And you can also visit the Wings website, wingsfund.me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cassia. It was a pleasure to have you here, and I hope that our audience also enjoyed this session. And we are heading to our next speaker. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Yes, so we finished our first part of this webinar, and I'm glad that it's not over yet. And we are heading from England to the Bay Area in USA, and I just want to connect Simon to our platform. Yes, and I want to present you with our another speaker. It's Simon Carles, who is a founder of the Game Discover Co-agency and runs the popular Game Discover Co-game Discoverability newsletter, a regular look at how people discover and buy video games in the 2020s and how your game could sell better. Previously, he was most known for his role helping to shape the Independent Game Festival and Game Developers Conference for many years. He has also been the publisher and editor-in-chief at both Gamasutra and Game Developer Magazine. Happy to have you here, Simon.
Hey there.
How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, everything works well.
Great.
So can we start with your presentation? Are you prepared and you uploaded your presentation here, or
Yes.
you are sharing the screen?
I'm going to screen share. So yeah, so basically, yeah, I have a presentation I'll be doing for about probably 40 minutes, and then obviously people feel free to type questions, and at the end I'll flick it off, and then we can answer all the questions. So let me try and share my screen here.
Yeah, so while Simon is trying to share his screen, so I would like to really encourage you to, again, post all your questions right here in the question box, and we will try to answer them at the end of this session. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. You can see my slides okay, right?
Yep.
Great. Cool. Well, great to be here. Yeah, as noted, my name's Simon Carles, and this is Perfecting Your Game Hook in the 10 Commandments of Discoverability. As for who I am, I guess I was already introduced a little bit, but I was a game developer, a designer in the 90s and early zeros, and then I spent a long time at the parent company of GDC, where I used to help run GDC and the Independent Games Festival. And more recently, I was the original investor, and I continued to advise No More Robots, who's a UK publisher who put out games like Descenders and Yes Your Grace. And last year, I launched this company called Game Discover Co., which has a popular newsletter, and I consult with a number of publishers and developers in this kind of space of how you get your game noticed. So I have a pretty broad set of experiences, and this is a good follow-up to Cassia, because Cassia was kind of talking a lot about, you know, why you should pick certain types of games and looking at the market, and this is much more of kind of a, I guess, a higher level view of kind of like, why would people be interested in your game very abstractly, and then how do you get people to discover your game while you're developing it before it comes out. So I'm going to start with a quote. This is not me, although Chris and I are both bald guys with glasses. This is Xbox's head of their independent developer program, Chris Charla, and he's voicing the central point of this talk. You know, you have to engineer ways for people to find out about your game, otherwise you'll have trouble. You know, and you can't really buy discoverability with money. You know, the act of discoverability, getting people to find out about your game, it needs to be thought about from the very start of when you start thinking about your concept. And you know, and the first part of this talk is about hook. And the phrase hook, really, you know, if you say a song has a really good hook, then it means, you know, obviously it's really catchy. And so I think that hook is really important and something you should think about a lot. And I think an incorrect way of considering hook is probably like, I'll make a game that I'm personally very excited about, and then I'll get a publisher to worry about whether they can sell it, or I'll hire someone in PR marketing for it when I'm nearly done. You know, I think that's a little bit dangerous. I think the correct thing to do is to have a really conscious focus on how people find your game. And so you need to think about how to stand out all the way from before you think of the central idea all the way to launch. And I think a good recommendation is, like, always think like you're the only person responsible for people finding out about your game, even if you're not, because then you won't kind of think, oh, someone else will take care of that for me. Here's a quote about hook. As I was noting, in music, a hook is a short riff or melody that really grabs the listener and gets stuck in their head. This is a quote from Ryan Clark, who made Crypto the Necrodancer. If you've seen that game, it's an excellent title, and some other really good stuff. He's actually an excellent publisher developer based out of Vancouver. And he does note, particularly here, in games, a hook is similar, but often takes place before the game is even played. And I think this is important. Like, people need to see your game and be excited by it. I think that, you know, many people make games and they obviously care a lot about it being a deep experience, but it is really important to think about when people see your game for the first time, what do they think? And so that's sort of a lot of my focus here. Like, how do viewers feel about your game if let's say they saw a 5-second GIF, or they saw 5 seconds of a video, or 10 seconds of a video? Like, you know, what do they feel? What do they think? And a lot of that is really people being excited by what it communicates visually. And this isn't just, is it very pretty? Like, what does it really communicate visually? What do people think about when they see it? And I'll try and list some of the ways I think you can stand out here. So certainly visually, one thing that really helps, I think, if you're going for a game that costs at least $20 or 15 or 20 euros, is, you know, does it look like it's a deep game? People really valuing depth in games nowadays because they want to feel like they can play it for a long time. And obviously that's a value judgment, but if it looks like quite complex or interesting, or you can see it has a lot of interesting gameplay mechanisms, then that probably helps. Art direction, obviously, this is the most obvious one. If people see a game that looks really beautiful, then they'll be like, oh, I want to play that game. So I think, you know, does it grab you visually? This is a little bit more of a subtle point, but if a game can feel kind of what I call visceral or juicy, there's a series of talks called Juice It or Lose It, which are specifically about this type of stuff. You know, does your game have good effects? Does it have good kind of bending, warping? Does it feel like stuff is really happening on the screen? Often games that have really good physics will play up, obviously, that. But I think that's another thing that can make people really kind of jump up and take notice when they see a very small clip of your game. And finally, I think alternative setting, you know, I have noted it's actually good to be similar to games a lot of the time, but there is a lot of fantasy, medieval, and dystopian games out there. So it is worth thinking sometimes, does a different setting make your game stand out visually? Most recently, there's a game called Empire of Sin, which is a gangster-themed game, and you know, it hasn't done quite as well as I expected, but it's still done much better than most of us would ever hope to do. So, and I think gangster is probably a good underlooked visual hook. So yeah. And then the other side of hook is kind of how you describe it to people, and this is obviously part of your pitch. But you know, can you describe the game's hook to anybody in one short sentence or paragraph? I think that's a really good thought experiment. One good example is from my friends at No More Robots. They have a game called Not Tonight, and it's described as a post-Brexit dystopian bouncer simulator. And you know, at the very least, I think that's interesting, and they might make people pay more attention. And as for the kind of text elements, I think that matter. I think having genre mashups. I think I saw Cassia reference having stuff with a twist. So I think if you can have a real strong genre, but it's a twist into another genre, that's what Crypt of the Necrodancer did. It's a roguelike, but it's also a rhythm game. I think that's a great hook that communicates via text. Having procedural or systemic elements is definitely really big right now, which is to say, games that are different every time you play them. It's really helpful for streamers, and it's also really interesting for people because it provides depth. So saying a game is procedural or replayable or roguelite, I think that's a really good text hook. Emphasizing a range of modes is the other way you can go with this. As long as people feel like there's a breadth of things to do, they might not mind that your game has one main mode. If it has a whole bunch of cool bonus modes, then that's great. And then I think when you describe games, you should use gameplay-centric language. I think a lot of people, especially if they've made the game themselves, are very interested in story. And I think story is great, but that's much more of a post-launch thing. It's much more of a word-of-mouth thing. Oh, I played this game and it had a great story. But I don't think you can really sell a game on story before it comes out. So I think you need to think more about kind of what do you do in the game that's exciting from a minute-to-minute basis? And then, how do you perfect your hook? Well, firstly, I think you should be talking to people, as many people as possible. Experts, sure, but also peers, just other friends. You can look at multiple concepts here. You should also look at data. I mean, obviously, sites like SteamDB, GameStats, Game Data Crunch will give you an idea of whether you're moving into the right kind of area for your game or not. You can show different versions of ideas. You can even do that publicly. I think, some people are quite protective about their game and they don't want to show anything until it's kind of very close to done. And what I'd say is, you can show concept ideas for your next game if you can get people to pay attention to them and sort of say, are you into this? So you can even like A/B test publicly. There's a developer called Philomena Schwab who's making a game called The Wandering Village right now, and she was doing her team was doing concepts on Imager and Reddit before they'd even started development on the game and before they'd even started the Kickstarter. So I think that's actually worth doing because you can effectively kind of see if people are excited a little bit before you even start making the game. Obviously, this is dependent on whether you have enough, whether you can get anyone's attention, I know, but yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think doing a lot of this before you really settle on an idea is actually a good idea. I know that probably a lot of you are partway through your games, but I think you can retrofit some of these ideas to the stuff you're working on. Just think about, what the biggest hook, what the hookiest part of your game is, and really play it up both visually and text-wise. You can also say, listen, my game's great. It doesn't need a hook. And that's sometimes true, but I think this under certain circumstances. I think, firstly, if your game is in a really specific niche and there just aren't that many games in that niche and people are excited about that niche, a good example is Colony Simulator. These games where you maybe in a space colony and you have to cultivate, and it's a strategy game. Like maybe that's enough of a hook. It's a colony simulator. People are looking out for those. That's great. If you're making a game for a subscription service, which is happening more nowadays with stuff like Game Pass and Apple Arcade, then you don't have to worry so much about your hook because you get paid anyway. And you just sort of have to make it a good game where people are coming along and checking it out. But even with those services, you often get bonuses from the more people who play it. So having a good hook is good. Then, I think the concept of being the only game in town. So, if there's absolutely nothing like it, people might want it, then that's an even greater version of the super niche genre. So, that's great as well. A good example for that is a game from Mega Robots, Descenders. It was a 3D mountain biking game when there weren't any other 3D mountain biking games. So you sort of then, if you want to buy that a 3D mountain game, you have to buy that game. So that's a good reason sometimes to go for a niche. And then also, the other way that many people cheat, and I think it gives people a false impression, is like if your players already love you because you've made 2 or 3 successful games, you sort of don't have to worry so much about hook. And this does lead to some of the bigger, most well-known developers not needing to worry about Hook and whether people notice it because they already have a fan base. But obviously, if you don't already have a fan base, then I think you do have to worry about it. And just actually, there might not be anyone here who's working on mobile, but I do sometimes get folks who ask me about mobile. So just quickly, mobile's pretty tricky to get into. I think much trickier in my view for a small studio than PC or console, and I actually wouldn't really recommend it in most cases unless you really understand free to play. Basically for finding new people on mobile, most of the time you're just paying for it, and you just need to have a better. You need to have really good monetization because then you can afford more ads. The hyper casual genre, which is all the kind of free games, which have ads in them, are actually interesting, and you can break out that way. But often those have really big companies who help cross promote, and again, it's quite difficult to get in as a solo dev. And premium, I occasionally run into people who are trying to make premium mobile games, i.e., a mobile game that you pay once for that costs $4 or $5. And in my newsletter, I've sort of shown some of the best examples of this. There's one or two mobile studios who've shared me their numbers, and you tend to make less money than PC or console because you're selling a game that's quite complicated for $5 that you could sell for $20 on PC and console. So you end up basically making a quarter of the money most of the time, unfortunately. Yeah, so I think mobile is difficult without a backer, whereas on PC in particular and console, you can go a fair way just working this on your own, whether you want a publisher or not. So I want to talk about game discoverability, and obviously my company is called Game Discover Co, so I'm very into this. Sort of where Hook fits in, that I think Hook is important, and maybe I think Hook is more important than some other people in this field, but I think other things are important as well. So I just sort of wanted to talk about what I think the other important things are if you're just sort of bringing your own game to launch. I would split it up by percentage. So for me, Hook is kind of 55%. It's really important whether you have a game with a strong concept or hook. But story beats I put at like 15%, and what I mean by story beats is as you announce the game and you start to talk to people about it or publicize it, what are the main 3 or 4 inflection points and when? So for example, announce the game with a gameplay trailer, be in the Steam Next Fest, things like that. So I think you need to think what your kind of big elements, that you're going to have around marketing or announcing or talking about your game are, and really concentrate on making a big deal of those 3 or 4 big items. Often will come with trailers or press releases. But then on the other hand, there's definitely studios out there, maybe back in the time of retail, you would just do those 3 or 4 story beats. But nowadays, I think you need to be talking to your players all the time. So obviously you need to be announcing very early, probably earlier than you think. And you want to keep interacting with your developers a lot. And, one of the best ways to do that is via Discord. You can also use blogs, Steam page, social media, but you really need to nurture these fans because they're the people who will be very excited on launch and give you your first 50 really good Steam reviews on maybe the first day, and that's going to be really helpful for your sales. Then launch sizzle. I think all these other things matter, but getting everything working at launch is important. Particularly streamer outreach. Streamers are much more important than they ever used to be. I think much more important than the conventional press. I'll talk about that in a bit. And really getting good press outreach. Fortunes of games can really change in the 2 weeks before or after release, especially if streamers pick them up. The streamers are the biggest wild card. So if you have a game that can be played repeatedly by streamers, then they can suddenly completely change your trajectory of launch, and you can do a lot better than you expected. But obviously that's for a very small minority of games, but it's still absolutely very important. So I was looking around for good quotes about how to think about games and discovery, and I thought this one was good as well. It's from the co-creator of the Farming Pet Sim Ooblets. And he originally said marketing here, and I'm afraid I changed it to discoverability. So you can say marketing, but I actually think he's talking, marketing is what can be used quite widely. And he's not talking about marketing in the sense of, sending out a press release. He's talking about what I think discoverability is. It's considering what's appealing integrating it into your product, and then demonstrating that appeal. So it's a very clear 3-step process. You're kind of like, what are people going to like? I'm going to put that into my product, and then I'm going to show them. And I think that's a deliberate process that it's always a good idea to step back and think about. So the other half of my talk here is about what I call the 10 commandments of game discovery. And honestly, there's so much to talk about when you talk about game discovery, marketing, community management. You could probably fill 20, 40 hours, but we have to focus on something. So this part of my talk looks at particular learnings that I've had over the past few years, which I don't think are always that obvious. But I want to make sure people understand if you want people to actually find your game. And ultimately, if people find your game, then that's going to make it successful. Firstly, this is a guy called Kevin Kelly, and he famously wrote an article back in 2008 suggesting that if you could just get $100 each from your 1,000 true fans every year, you can make a great living. Obviously, we can't charge $100 for our games, probably, but we can certainly try and gather and interact with our fans during development to show them what we're working on and get excited. So, I definitely think that, having your Discord crew together, having people excited, getting a very positive review start because you've really nurtured those folks and you really talk to them regularly about what you're working on. You show them alpha versions of the game. You have private betas, you're sort of actively play testing with them, you're getting them involved, they care about you as a person and a developer. Having that kind of link to the people who might be interested in buying your game is incredibly important. You can't just come out of nowhere, or at least some people do, and that's obviously one of the issues here. But most of the time, you just can't come out of nowhere and say, "Here's my game," when everyone's like, "Yes." You sort of need to have primed the interest a little bit. So this is sort of like I'm trying to find like what should you be tracking in order to understand whether your game is going to be successful or not, and try and change the trajectory in some way. And a lot of what I do at Game Discover Co is I look at pre-release indicators like, are you in the top 900 wish list for unreleased games on Steam, or how many followers do you have? And so I think for you, if you've announced your game and it's available, at least to the pages available to view on Steam, I think this is a really good a really good number to look at. It's your daily organic wishlist additions, and by that I mean how many wish lists are you adding every day when there is nothing else going on. The reason I think this is important is that sort of shows just your natural interest in the market. And what I think is happening nowadays is, people know that wish lists on Steam are important, and so they're finding ways to increase their wish lists that may not always correlate to the perfect result, because a lot of the time there's these pre-release showcases you can get in which do increase your wish lists, but they may be much more casual wish lists. So you sometimes run into people nowadays who are kind of launching with 20,000 wish lists, and then their game does kind of badly, and I feel bad. But then when I ask them about it, I'm like, so how many of those wish lists did you get naturally without kind of these big features? Sometimes it's as many as, only 2,000 of the 20,000 were got just in regular wish listing. And so I think it's giving people a bit of a false impression of the popularity of their game. So, certainly when I look at Steam wish lists added every day, I see as low as 2 and as high as 200. And actually, I'm sure there's far higher than 200, but that's just the games that I interact with. So, it is difficult to change that number, but I think that'll give you a good indication of what your natural interest in your game is. And you should obviously always be trying to shift it up, that regular number, rather than. I think you should also be in these pre-release showcases, like Steam Next Fest, Steam festivals, and things. But I think you should just be realistic about whether that interest is quite as genuine as folks who are coming and checking it every day. So, in my view, a surprisingly large amount of games that are popular are due to this maxim, which is, I played this game and now I want more games like it. I think Cassio referenced this actually a little bit, which is, games are often finite in length, so and you eventually get bored of them, and then players really enjoy games that are twists or turns of concepts they loved in the past. So, often I find I was looking at a game the other day that I think is a really good looking game, but it's not really the same as any other game. And sometimes I think that is a disadvantage because people don't have a frame of reference, and having a frame of reference is often very helpful. And actually, Chris Zukowski, who got mentioned earlier, did some video tracking of players on Steam with their permission. And he saw a lot of this game hopping. He saw like, oh, look, this game is being recommended to me. It looks a bit like this other game that I really like. I might wishlist it because of that. So I think, that's something that is really worth thinking about. There's some good examples recently. I think Cities Skylines was a massive hit because everyone loved or loves SimCity and vanilla city builders. And for whatever reason, nobody had made a vanilla city builder in a really long time, just a very standard one, not a post-apocalyptic one or medieval one. And so that was great. And Stardew Valley, you can argue that's a continuation of Harvest Moon with some Minecraft-like crafting, but there's definitely a lineage there in that style of game, and it was an underappreciated and a genre at that time. So I think the difficult bit is working out which game types actually have people waiting to play them and aren't oversaturated, like Metroidvanias, for example. I think on the one hand, very tempting. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of people trying to launch into that particular subgenre. So you have to weigh that up very carefully. But I think it's worth thinking about this stuff quite deliberately as you plan your games. So this is about organic versus paid. I don't know how many of you are relying on kind of paid traffic to find stuff, and I've maybe backed off this view a little bit nowadays. I've been very extreme on paid acquisition. I think a good example is No More Robots is kind of way over $10 million gross lifetime, and it has $5,000 of paid ads. So it's really not been a priority for No More Robots. I have more recently run into some folks. There's a publisher called Hooded Horse out of the US who are spending money on ads, and they've talked to me about it a lot. And I think they do know what they're doing, and it's likely positive ROI for them. But honestly, Steam has just introduced this UTM tracking, which allows us to at least track a little bit more. But you can't pixel track on Steam or consoles. And the way that Facebook and certainly mobile, before Apple introduced these new rules, have done it is, that they can track all the way down to individual users about how much money they spend in the game. And that's just not possible on Steam and console. So most of the time when you're paying for ads, whether it be on Facebook or Twitter or on Reddit, you can vaguely guess the number of wish lists you get as a result, but you don't know whether those wish lists are going to convert or not. So I definitely think that it's good to spend a bit of money around launch, maybe for kind of visibility purposes. But I find a lot of people are spending money like they spend a ton of money during launch, but there's going to be a really big natural spike during launch. So how do you even know that your ads are changing that spike? And the same during your Steam sale. Steam sales. As soon as you go on sale the first time, you're always going to do 5 times as much revenue on your first sale. So it's difficult to see whether things are making a difference. So I guess my general comment there is, especially if you're working with publishers, talk to them about their paid ads and sort of how they know they work and how much money they're spending on it. And especially if you're a developer, if they're spending a lot of money on paid ads which comes out of your recoup, then I would definitely talk to them about that, because I'm not convinced it's a great use of money always. So I myself was editor-in-chief of Gamasutra.com and Game Developer Magazine, so I'm obviously a fan of the traditional media, but tracking sales or wishlist spikes based on who's covered stuff, at this point, social media is a very small blip. I know people spend a lot of time on Twitter, and Twitter does not seem to me to be very good for getting interest in your game, even if you get a lot of retweets. Actually, there's some other social media like TikTok in particular seems very good right now, and Reddit and Imager. Those games I think do better on the social side. And then and the other thing is, if you work with traditional PR, they'll spend a lot of time trying to get covered by traditional media websites. And, honestly, in the Steam space, very few of those lead to significant extra interest in your game. I think Rock, Paper, Shotgun, which is a site many of you may know, is definitely as helpful. And I think Kotaku, and I'm sure local websites in your countries. But you can't see those increases on the wish list or the follower graphs that I look at on Steam. What you can see is big streamers, and particularly big YouTubers. And so I do feel like the amount of time that everyone spends in, like reaching out to people, like I think everyone should spend a lot more time reaching out to streamers than they should to the press. And unfortunately, reaching out to streamers is a very manual task. You want to do stuff like research people who've played similar games to yours and individually email them and have to find their address from somewhere. And it's not that easy. But if you look at the actual sales effects of getting some of these big streamers to pay attention to your games, it seems like a much better use of everyone's time. Put the good stuff up front. So I think a lot of people have a view that they can sort of market their game a bit like some of these really big kind of Halo-style Metal Gear Solid titles and sort of keep people guessing and kind of tease out information. I think that makes sense if your game is a certain size, if you're a big developer, if people are like super excited. But if you're really starting from a lower level than that, like I think what you should really do is debut your game early and show the full scope of the game, because people are only going to come and check out your game once. And so my sort of challenge is always, why would you not want to list all the information you can about the game for the one time they come to your Steam page or your official website? So I think if as much as possible, you should debut with something that looks like it's a full game and has a full gameplay trailer, even if that gameplay isn't all working yet, and even if you're only showing a little bit of it, and as close to the final pitch as possible, and mention all the modes you're planning to have in the final game, because ultimately, people will come to your website, or the Steam page, they'll read the information and look at the visuals you have, and they'll click wishlist or not. And so I think you want to do the best possible job of explaining to them what your game is, and not sort of say, well, we'll put up something and then in 6 months' time we'll talk about this other mode. I think just get it all out there. I think it really helps. On discovery and post-launch, I think there's one post-release marketing tool that I really believe in, and that is discounting your game. And I know this is sort of obvious, and everyone discounts their game, but I think having a very methodical and smart approach to how you discount your game after launch is really important, because I've certainly seen stats saying I think the majority of many games' revenues are during sales. And I think you need to work out how to have marketing beats after launch. Like, I think it's really a good idea for your game not to be finished when it releases. So if you can do themed updates, if you can do things that are exciting, if you can do streamer-friendly themed updates, then that's great. But the other thing that is clearly a marketing beat, which gets people to discover your game, is discounting your game. And so, my view is definitely don't discount by a large percentage, but discount almost as often as possible, because a lot of people are not paying attention, and they won't see your first discount, and maybe they'll see your third discount, and it all gets passed around in different places. So I'm definitely a fan of, Steam allows you to discount every 6 weeks plus the big sales. I would say like almost do it as often as that, for like a week every time. And you don't have to make a big fuss about it every time, but every time you do it on Steam, your wish listers will get emailed, and other people will notice it. So it's actually it's doing it less seems illogical. I think you're just leaving money on the table there. And I've definitely seen some people, especially like, for example, say you launch your game, maybe you're a little bit disappointed. A lot of people then just sort of walk away and don't do any discount management. And I think you can probably increase your year one revenue by 30% by doing better discount management, and also having attention to detail on it, because it is a little bit complicated. Like Switch, for example, has different discounts for both Europe and the US with different cooldown timings. So you really have to keep an eye on that kind of stuff. On the streamer side of things, yeah, just I mentioned this in passing, but there are more streamers than you can possibly imagine. You know, there's streamers who stream in your native language. There's streamers who stream in languages you don't understand. There's English language streamers, and I think you should try and find all of them. You know, there's games I've worked on. There's been German language only streamers, and nobody who works on the game, other than the translator who translated it to German, understands German. But they've boosted the game massively. And you know, I think so. It just shows how important that is. And I think you do sort of need to find this stuff yourself. You know, there are sites like Woovit, WOOVIT, or Keymailer, and I think they're worth doing to kind of augment your streamer outreach. But I don't think you always get some of the highest profile YouTubers using them. So I think you do need to use a lot of legwork here. You know, like. You need to send emails which have keys in them explaining what the game is, and try your luck. On the subject of demos for discoverability, you know, I think people are quite, I wouldn't say confused, but people are very mixed about demos for your game, especially before it releases. There's been a big resurgence in demos recently. It used to be nobody was doing demos. Now, especially due to the Steam Game Festival or Next Fest, there's a lot of people doing demos. And I do feel like people are a little bit confused about whether they work or not. And my comment is, I think demos are sometimes an early predictor of how well your game is going to do, more than the reason that your game is popular. In other words, your demo or Steam prologue will do well if the full game is going to do well. But I do think sometimes they can boost things significantly, especially if your game is already going to be popular. So my recommendation in general is that you should be in, you should always be in at least one Steam Next Fest or Steam Festival with a demo of your game before it comes out, because it's a really good marketing point. People who are excited about your game can check it out, and there are streamers who check out these festivals, and sometimes things blow up because of them. You know, I think Loop Hero is from Devolver is a great example. Loop Hero definitely blew up in part because of its demo in the Spring Festival. So I think it can help, although those festivals are getting quite crowded. There's 500 or 600 games in them. So, but I think doing it limited, I think, is better. I mean, I think you can just have your demo available, your prologue available all the time. You just have to really understand what you're offering and how it compares to your final game, because there's definitely been people who've put out a demo that's been really successful, and then their final game has not been successful, and it's because they either gave away too much of the game in their demo, or really their game just wasn't deep enough, and people got more casual players, and you tend to get more casual players with your demo, just had a lot of fun with the demo, and then it wasn't an indicator of their final game. So I think having a short, sharp, replayable demo is good. But certain types of games aren't well suited to demos, so I think it's a little complicated. Finally, understand which player management issue you have. So most of the time, we have hype issues, and by that I mean people aren't excited about your game. You need to make them more excited. But sometimes you run into expectation issues. Now, obviously, maybe only 10% of people, but I'm sure some people who are listening right now will have this, where people are very excited about your game, and that's great. But my question is always, are people excited about the game you're actually releasing? And have you explained that properly? Because there's sometimes a difference between hype and reality. And obviously, we've run into this with games like No Man's Sky, where people felt like they overpromised a little bit before the game came out, and then there was a big backlash. And that's a very extreme version. But I've often seen this issue where games have an interesting premise, and people are sold into the premise, but they don't really understand what the gameplay is like. And so that means when the game comes out, they buy it, they play it, and they're not very impressed. You immediately get mixed reviews or negative reviews on Steam, and then your game is kind of done. It's not going to sell that well anymore. So that's actually, I think, if you are finding your game is taking off and people are getting excited about it, think really carefully about your presentation. Maybe start a frequently asked questions file in your Steam forums. Really make sure that you've explained it to people so that the people who are excited are still going to be excited when they play the game. Finally, I'm a big data guy, and so I wanted to mention some data sources that I think are really helpful when you're trying to work out what's going on. SteamDB, steamdb.info, is by far the most transparent platform. I prefer it to Steam Spy. Steam Spy is probably a pretty well-known platform, but it's run by someone who's worked for Epic Game Store for the past 5 years, so it's not really being updated anymore. But I think SteamDB, you can look at for games that you're being compared to. You can look at concurrent users, owner estimates, streaming spikes, although some other sites are better at tracking streaming, like a site called Sully Gnome for Twitch. And also follower trending. I'm a big fan of followers as an indicator. Followers is on Steam when you click to follow news about the game. It tends to be about 1/9 of your Steam wish lists, but it's public for all games. So you can really get a good idea about how games are doing based on their follower trending. And SteamDB has like 18 months worth of follower trending for every single game on Steam. So that's really helpful. Game Stats is a website. It has some subscriber-only features. It's not that expensive though, but it's particularly good for Steam tag browsing. If you're trying to see kind of, what the top games in certain tags are, I believe if you subscribe, you can see average and median revenues, something I think was mentioned with a Chris Zukowski article. It's being updated in real time. I think it's just really helpful to seeing what's big. I would also say, if you always sort by what's big, then you're always going to see the stuff that's sold incredibly well. And that's why you need to look carefully at stuff like median revenue, which is really, what did the 50th percentile game do in this particular tag? And so, but I also recommend going to Steam itself and sort by latest release and just look around and see how games are doing. For example, I was looking at a walking simulator the other day, and I discovered that there's a lot of free and sub $5 games in that tag, and they don't have great reviews. So maybe it's difficult to stand out there, even with a $20 game. So that's worth checking out. Steam250.com is another Steam scraping site. I quite like it though, because it has a Club 250 section for each game, and they've done a lot of work with some of my algorithms to work out gross and net revenue estimates for games on Steam. So I know, how much did this game make on Steam is always pretty controversial, but they've done a bunch of stuff like they've tracked discount percentages and tried to map it, and theirs is closer than a lot of other things I've seen. So if you want to try and work out what a possible range, and again, it's a range of 3 times, because you can't be that accurate. But I think it's quite good for working out, what actual net revenue, because remember, net revenue on Steam is 58% of gross. What net revenue did a certain game get? And then there's my own hype charts. So as part of my newsletter, which is actually on gamediscover.co nowadays, and it's a free newsletter, but it has a paid kind of data and bonus newsletter section. And what we do is we have a back end where we scrape every single unreleased Steam game and we assign it a score. So if you have an unreleased game right now, you can see what score your game is and how it compares to the other games and how it's trending. And we do that by looking at wishlist ranking for unreleased games where available, followers, Steam forum chatter. We look a little bit about community. We look at the track record of the publisher. So it's just a good general guide. Like, people often say, "Oh, this game came out of nowhere, and I can't believe it was successful." And a lot of the time, it didn't come out of nowhere. It's just that these pre-release Steam stats aren't really very looked at. So, for example, there's a game in here called Carlson that I'm guessing not a ton of you have heard of, and it's made by a popular YouTuber. And I don't know, it may not do super well when it comes out, but I mean, it has 65,000 followers on Steam right now, which implies over 500,000 wish lists. So that's kind of crazy, right? Yeah, and I think that's basically it. So happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing, but all kinds of stuff I could take questions on.
Great presentation. Thank you for sharing a lot of practical insights and already giving out your resources that you are using for our own audience here. And we have questions out here in the chat, and I think that more of them will come into the chat box, as you covered a lot of topics out here, and I think that lots of questions are gonna pop up out here. So let's start with the question that Ole has written, and she's questioning. So you create a Steam page to get the visibility very early in the development, but there is nothing to stream yet. How would you go about getting attention if paid ads aren't promising?
That's a good question. So, I think if you launch a game, if you launch your Steam page, then ideally you should have some kind of gameplay video for your game, even if the game is not completely finished. So I think what you can start doing is, you're going to put out. Ideally, I think when you start your Steam page, you should have an announced trailer, and it should have a little bit of gameplay in it. So that's your big first kind of announcement, and that's how you get people to come to your Discord, for example. And then from there, I think you should be doing a whole bunch of updates, both on your Discord and on your Steam news, with like, hey, here's a new feature. Look, we're making this cool thing on stream, maybe. And actually, a game that's really good at this, which I've recommended to several people, is there's a game called The Rift Breaker. And the devs are quite transparent. And if you look in my newsletter, if you Google like Game Discover Code, the Rift Breaker, then you'll see that they let me run something on how they got 250,000 Steam wish lists pretty quickly, and I think they have way more than that now. But if you go look at the Rift Breaker's Steam news section, you'll see that they have pretty interesting blog posts and updates every like 2 weeks about what they're working on and new features and GIFs. And so really, I think a lot of it is you've got to keep that going to attract people.
Great. Thanks for answering this one. And we have another question from Henry, and I want to connect his question with a question of Janus, because both of them are talking about some kind of social media platform or streaming platform. So the question from Henry is, do you believe that YouTubers and streamers are the future of game marketing? Are there some statistics for types of marketing and effect? And also, Janus is adding, you mentioned that TikTok is great for getting people to see your posts and direct traffic. Can you name other places that work well for that? So question about YouTube, streamers, TikTok, and other platforms that works well, and the statistics, how to get it.
Yeah. So yeah, firstly, streamers. Yeah, I mean, I do think streamers are really important if you have that type of game. And I will say there are some types of games where maybe they're a little bit less streamer friendly. But if you sort of want to break out of the pack, getting a lot of streamers to play your game is important. But you do need to think about the kind of games that streamers play, and a lot of the time they're playing games that are kind of, maybe they have a short gameplay length and they're replayable. A lot of the core PC gamers are playing stuff like that. So I do think that YouTubers and streamers are increasingly important to game marketing, and I think in general PR marketing companies, with some exceptions, have been a little bit slow to pick up on this. So, I think they're still spending excess time trying to target websites and magazines. And I think those guys can be helpful because they actually, streamers may notice games that way. But I definitely think a lot more time should be spent on that. And in terms of kind of statistics for effect, I've certainly seen, if you look at some of my newsletters, like probably the Rift Breaker one, so if you Google Game Discover Code, the Rift Breaker, I think there's some annotated stats in there about the effects of various streamers and other people on, you can see the effect on wish lists or followers for a game before it's released, and people are often transparent about that. Like they'll have a wish list spike and they'll be like, oh, that in fact in my member-only Discord today, there's a dev who got their game featured by a YouTuber called Wanderbots, and they went from having like 10 wish lists a day to 800 yesterday. So it's So I think there's some very clear kind of cause and effect there. You can also pay for streamers, and I think that's somewhat worth it if you can find the right streamers. And it's certainly, I think, paying for paid streams, they have to be labeled paid. is probably as worth regular advertising. But yeah, I think just paying a lot of attention to this, because games are very visual, and obviously streamers, it's all streaming video, so that's great. As for TikTok, TikTok's a fairly new thing, and I think is popular in certain countries and not others as well. But there's been some pretty amazing stats. I ran in my newsletter recently. There was a game called Before Your Eyes, I think, where I was looking at their followers and wish list, because we tracked them before launch, and it was doing like okay. It had like 1,000 followers, so maybe like 9,000 wish lists, and then suddenly it took off like a rocket, like 5 days before the game came out. And I noticed in the comments, people were talking about they'd seen the game in a TikTok, and I discovered there was a TikTok made by the Wholesome Games TikTok that had 500,000 likes and I think a couple of million views. And it really powered a lot of interest in the game just when it came out. And obviously that's quite difficult to replicate, but it was a very, very large effect. And it's partly because the game is a very high concept and interesting game. It's a game where it uses the webcam and you blink to change environments. So it's like very visually catchy game, very kind of interesting idea. But I've seen several examples of this now, of kind of, you know, TikTok being a really good example of social media if you can get it right, because things can go very viral, and it really does seem to be great for your wish list and followers. And I would say I've never seen that on Twitter, and I have seen it on TikTok, which is interesting given the amount of time people spend sometimes on Twitter, which I think, I mean, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, but I think it can be a bit of an echo chamber. So I would definitely say other places besides TikTok, you know, definitely Imager. I've just typed Imager so that people know how that's spelled. Yeah, definitely Imager. There's whole tutorials, again, I've linked on my newsletter elsewhere, about how to get popular Imager posts. But Imager is a really good one for games, because a lot of people who play games like read Imager and like these posts where it's like, I've been making a game, here's some really cool GIFs from my game. So, and you can see a real good bump from that. And also I think Reddit, I've been working with a dev who just announced his game, which had a lot of physics in it, and he put a GIF of his game in the Reddit game physics subreddit. And yeah, I think it got a whole bunch of upvotes. So I think, you know, the only thing on Reddit is they're quite particular about self-promotion, and all subreddits have their own rules. So you will tend to get your posts kicked out from a bunch of the subreddits, which I always feel like I've had it happen to me personally when I've been like posting something that I thought was useful from Game Discover Co, and then they're like, self-promotion, like, and then they nuke the post. So don't be upset if people like ban your posts. But I think, you know, as long as you're not being too self-promotional, or you put it in the right place, then I think Reddit is definitely worth exploring. But I would definitely say, like, in my kind of hype chart of social media I'm excited about, I guess it would go sort of like, I mean, Twitch and YouTube, if you call them social media, are right at the top. Then it's sort of TikTok, Imager, Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn's zero. Yeah, so those are the ones I think about.
Okay, moving on, and thank you for Ola Jurgensen for assisting us to track all those questions that are popping up in the chat box. Rain Zobel was wondering about the discoverability of VR products. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, that's a really good question. Like, VR has been in a bit of a slump in some ways, because there was a long time when you couldn't make good money on VR. I think people are of the opinion now that VR is coming back, particularly because of the Oculus Quest 2, I think. And so obviously it depends where you're, where you're kind of posting your game, but you can still put your game on Steam. And then a lot of the same stuff I was talking about will work for Steam. Really, I think one thing that's a big deal right now is Quest 2. Oculus Quest 2 has a curated store. And so it doesn't let all games on it. And honestly, curated stores, when they exist, are always really good news for games that can get on the curated store. So I would say, like, if anyone is making a VR game, like the single thing that you could do to ensure its success is to get on the Quest 2 store. I believe they've now added a loophole where you can search for individual games and find them, but you won't. That's not really that helpful if you don't know you're gonna buy the game already. So yeah, so I definitely think like a lot of discoverability for VR right now is about platform relationships, and there are a lot of VR games out there that have underperformed historically. But I think what I'm hearing is, some people who made a game a while ago have now got it on Quest 2 and it's done really well. So the question is there now going to be a flood of games targeting these new VR platforms? But a lot of it seems to be kind of a platform visibility issue rather than you doing it yourself, which is like more difficult for VR.
Okay, so moving on, and in this webinar, one of the third of our participants are representing the game ecosystem supporters, and some not startups, but incubators, universities, support organizations. So Pedro Zambon is wondering whether there is some kind of tools or specific methods how to create good game ideas with great discoverability hooks, for example, as game jams. Do you have some recommendations what incubations could take into account while growing their ecosystem?
I think game jams is a really interesting one because there's been some really notable games that have done really well through game jams. I just type in chat, like the game Baba Is You, which I'm sure some of you have seen, which is a really interesting puzzle game that's done really quite well. Was originally a game jam title, and they spent a lot of time expanding it. Yeah, I mean, there were definitely games. I know that Double Fine's had some games like Stacking, which I really liked, and I think maybe even Costume Quest was a game jam game. And I know Bossa Studios, who I chatted to a little bit recently. All their games like Surgeon Simulator was also a game jam title. So I do think that the game jam games can be good if you're trying to really make it a very kind of catchy concept. The only negative for a lot of these game jam games is like the higher concept you go, the more difficult it is to build it into a full game. And so sometimes these kind of very catchy game jam titles can be a bit kind of single idea, and then it's kind of like, well, how do you make that into an 8-hour game or a 10-hour game? But yeah, I think game jams are great for kind of innovation, and I think you can get some really interesting titles coming out of them. So I think that's one way to definitely consider it. I also think that just being very deliberate about like, if someone is thinking about making their next game, actually have 5 ideas and then sort of workshop those ideas, rather than saying like the next game I make has to be this idea. Then I think you can really weigh up the pros and cons. And some of the pros and cons are, like, is this a really good idea? Is this in a good genre? Because the other thing is, like, let's say you have an amazing idea for a game, but it's a 2D puzzle platformer. I might not recommend that you make that game, even if it's a great idea, because 2D puzzle platformers have a median Steam tag revenue of $800, which is like 1/7 of the average and like 1/40th of grand strategy games or something. So it's sort of like, so you have to weigh up how good is the idea, what genre or tags is it in, how easy is it to complete. But I'm just kind of like if more people can think more consciously about this before they start developing their game, or as they start developing their game, then it's really going to help them further down the road when they come to market it and realize it's difficult to describe the game, or it doesn't show very well, or something like that.
Thank you, Simon. And we are moving to probably our final question. And the final question would be like a practical exercise to apply all your insights and knowledge that you presented out here, just to test one of the hooks that one of our listeners will try to use maybe in his practice. So what do you think about the hook, a Buddhist myth told through the language of violence? Is it good? And could you comment a bit, what would you change and why? Just let to all the listeners how they can, do their own hooks. for their games?
Yeah, I think it's intriguing. I think it sort of depends whether you want to intrigue people or really kind of, is this a I want to know more hook, or is this a here is what the game does kind of hook? And and I think it's kind of like I'm just going to try and type something while I'm thinking about this, but it needs to be a little bit more kind of like I've typed in something like a deep exploration of both myths with dynamic, replayable combat, like something like that, where you're sort of like like you're trying to imply that it's got depth. Well, I just said deep. That's kind of cheating. And you're trying to imply that it's exciting, and you're trying to imply that people could play it multiple times. And you're trying to. I mean, I think a lot of the hook is the danger is. I think traditional marketing has always been like tell me more about this. But I think in today's very busy society, people just sort of want to know like. Does this capture my mind? Am I going to say, yeah, that sounds great, I'm going to do that? So I think in general, my comment is kind of like, less teasy stuff, more explicit stuff, and try and make it sound large and exciting and dynamic and replayable.
So Simon, would you take another question or?
Sure. Yeah.
So it's the question from Otz. Would you rather have a one-liner that is interesting in terms of immersing the player in a thought, or rather have it more like a call to action where the player think about how the game plays?
I'm going to try and find quickly. So No More Robots announced a game called Let's Build a Zoo like yesterday, and so I'm just gonna, obviously, I have nothing to do with their Steam capsule. I think they're quite good at it, and so this is their Steam capsule for Let's Build a Zoo, and it's very, very direct and practical, but it sounds cool. So So it's like, here is what you do in the game. It's time to build a zoo. Construct and decorate enclosures, buy and breed animals, hire zookeepers and vets. And then try your hand at DNA splicing and you can make over 300,000 different types of animal. And I think that's kind of, and I actually happen to think Let's Build a Zoo is going to be quite popular because it has a pretty good hook. And its hook is, it's a zoo game. Everyone loves zoo games. It's a deep management game, and you can splice together every single type of animal, even if it's ridiculous. So you could have a capybara and an owl spliced together to make an owly-bara, and all that kind of stuff. So, so I think it does need to be like what you do in the game, but also I think what you do in the game needs to excite people when they hear about it, and that's sort of a thing with your game that you can't necessarily engineer in later. So that's why marketing and marketing is important, but you also need to have kind of had a good idea originally that you can then communicate in a very direct and dynamic way.
Thank you for all your answers. I think they were very, very valuable. Also, the presentation was really good. And all good things should come to an end. And this webinar is also coming to an end. But I just want to say one more word to our listeners that we are not finishing with this webinar. We will continue to give you more insights next month. So please save the date on 1st of June. So we will having a webinar about team building, team culture, and team formation in game development. I think it's an exciting topic, and the webinar will be free as this one. So feel free to join us, and we will take into account your suggestions, what kind of topics we should take into consideration for our later webinars. And also we will circulate the survey about this webinar, which will land in your email. So please give us a feedback. It is very valuable for us in order to create a better experience, to get a better presentations, but I think those that we had today was very valuable and really great ones. So thank you for all who participated here, and thank you, Simon. Thank you, Kasia, for being here. For you, Simon, to be with us so early there in USA. Have a great day, and for all of those you in Europe, have a great evening. So see you on the next webinars. Good luck.
Thank you.